Kate Middleton stood near the tall windows of Kensington Palace, the early morning light casting soft shadows across the marble floor. Outside, London was slowly waking up, but inside the palace, everything was still. Kate had been awake since, before sunrise. She had barely slept. Her heart was heavy, and her thoughts refused to rest. Today was the Children's Hope Foundation Gala. She had attended it many times before, but today would be different. Today, she would go alone. Prince William had left the night before on urgent royal duty. Usually they faced these events together, united, prepared, and smiling for cameras. But this time, the responsibility was hers alone. She had a speech ready, neatly written and rehearsed, filled with polite words about charity and duty. It was the kind of speech that pleased the press. But deep down, Kate felt uneasy. Something didn't feel right. As the car drove through the streets toward the Royal Opera House, Kate sat quietly, staring out the window. Her team had made sure everything was perfect. The dress, the hairstyle, the small pearl earrings. But none of that could calm the strange feeling growing inside. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A sense that this evening would not go as planned. When she arrived, the building shimmered with warm light. Cameras clicked as she stepped out. Flashes lit up the street, but Kate smiled gently and waved with grace. Inside, the ballroom sparkled. Tall golden chandeliers hung above tables dressed in white cloth and fine silverware. Elegant guests moved around the room, their laughter soft and polite. Most of them were wealthy donors. They wore suits and evening gowns, carrying glasses of wine and speaking in quiet tones. Everyone seemed comfortable, but Kate's eyes were drawn to the back of the room. There, far from the spotlight, sat a group of people who didn't seem like the rest. Their clothes were simple. Their smiles were nervous, but kind. These were the families and children helped by the foundation. Kate could feel it. These were the real heroes of the evening. She noticed a teenage boy with dark hair and a shy expression. He looked around the room, unsure of where he fit in, made her way toward him. His name was Jaime. She introduced herself, and his eyes widened. He bowed his head politely, but she could see he was trying to be brave. They began to talk. Jaime told her how he used to suffer from terrible anxiety, how school felt like a battlefield, how he avoided crowds, even his own friends. But after working with the Foundation's therapy program, he had found tools to help him breathe, calm his thoughts, and feel strong again. Kate listened closely. She didn't just hear his words, she felt them. His story touched something deep inside her. All around the room, she saw the same thing happening. Families were not just sitting quietly at the back anymore. They were walking around, speaking to donors, shaking hands, sharing their stories. With strength and honesty, Kate watched in awe. These people had been through pain, but they weren't asking for pity. They were standing tall, telling the truth about their journey. Margaret Thompson, the head of the foundation, appeared at Kate's side. "This is what I love most about tonight," Margaret said, smiling. "It brings people together from different worlds, and every voice matters." Kate nodded, but deep inside, her anxiety was rising. Her prepared speech suddenly felt wrong. It was safe, polite, but it didn't match what she had just heard. How could she walk up on stage and talk about the importance of giving when real? Stories of courage had already filled the room. She turned to Margaret with hesitation. "Would it be all right," Kate asked quietly, "if I changed my speech?" Margaret blinked, surprised. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. What would you like to say instead?" "I'm not sure yet," Kate admitted. "But I want to speak from the heart. I want to talk about what I've seen and learned tonight." Margaret placed a warm hand on her arm. "That would be wonderful. Sometimes the most powerful words come from honesty, not paper." Kate gave a small nod, but her hands were cold. She wasn't used to speaking without a script, without control, without knowing what would happen next. As the lights in the ballroom dimmed and the audience took their seats, Kate stood behind the curtain, her heart pounding in her chest. The paper speech was folded neatly in her clutch, untouched. She wasn't going to read it. She was going to speak the truth. And as the announcer called her name, and she walked toward the podium under the soft glow of stage lights. She knew this moment would change her forever. As Kate stepped onto the stage, the room became still. The sound of applause filled the air, but her heartbeat was louder in her ears. She walked slowly toward the podium, her hands lightly shaking, her mind full of the voices she had heard that evening. She had spoken at royal events, before dozens of them. But this moment felt completely different, because tonight, she wasn't going to read what had been written for her. She was going to speak from the deepest part of her heart. She reached the podium, took a deep breath, and looked out across the ballroom. Faces stared back at her, some familiar, some not. There were wealthy donors in glittering gowns, foundation workers in modest suits, and, most importantly, families who had lived through struggle and pain. And all of them were watching her. "Good evening," Kate began, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight." She paused. The room was quiet now. People were listening. "I had a speech prepared for this evening," she said, glancing briefly at her folded notes. But something changed. She looked up again, her eyes finding Jaime and his mother sitting at a table toward the back. Jaime gave her a small, nervous smile. "Tonight, I spent time speaking with some of the young people and families this foundation has helped," Kate continued, "and I realized the words I had planned to say are not what's needed tonight, because what I've seen and heard this evening has touched me more deeply than I can explain." There was a shift in the room. People leaned forward. Something about her voice, sincere and clear, felt different than usual. "I met a young man named Jaime," she said gently. "He told me how, just a year ago, he was afraid to leave his house. How simple things like speaking in class or going to the shop filled him with fear. But through the support of this foundation, through patient, loving help, he found a way forward. He found his voice." Kate looked at Jaime again, and this time he was sitting taller. His mother wiped away a tear. "That story is not rare," Kate went on. "Everywhere I turned tonight, I heard stories like Jaime's stories, of struggle, of courage, of healing, and I realized I am not here just to thank you for your donations. I am here to tell you that these young people have given me something tonight. They've reminded me what true strength looks like." Her voice wavered slightly, but grew stronger again. "I've often felt pressure in this role," she admitted, "to smile perfectly, to speak perfectly, to never show weakness. But the truth is, I'm human too. I've had nights when I've questioned whether I'm doing enough. I've had mornings where I looked in the mirror and wondered if I was strong enough to carry this role." The ballroom was silent. Kate continued. "Tonight, these brave families have taught me something I'll never forget, that strength is not about hiding pain. It's about being honest, even when it's hard. It's about choosing to be real, to be open, to be present." Pause. She could feel tears forming in her eyes, but she did not look away. Little Emma, who once refused to speak after facing terrible pain, found her voice because someone simply sat with her every day, in silence and love. That simple act changed her life, and it reminds me that being there for one another, even when we don't have all the answers, is sometimes the greatest gift we can give. She looked across the audience again. Some were quietly crying, others were completely still, holding on to every word. "I want to thank you," Kate said. "Not just for supporting the Children's Hope Foundation, but for listening, for believing, for showing up. And I want to thank the families who have shared their truth with me tonight. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." She paused one last time, her hand softly gripping the podium. "And so I speak to you tonight, not as a princess," she said, her voice now trembling, "but as a woman who has been deeply moved, as a mother, as someone who is still learning what it truly means to lead with heart." Then slowly, Kate lowered her head. She said nothing more. No more words were needed. The room fell into a deep silence, one that was full of emotion, full of respect. It was as if time had frozen. People did not clap. They simply stood in awe of the moment. Even King Charles, watching quietly from the corner of the room, stood up slowly, his eyes glistening in that silence. Kate had spoken the loudest truth of all. The silence in the ballroom felt like a soft blanket wrapping around everyone. It was not cold or awkward. It was full of emotion, respect, and something deeper than words. No one moved. No one clapped. It was as if the whole room had been touched by something they couldn't explain. And in the middle of that silence stood Kate, her head still lowered, tears quietly sliding down her cheek. Then, slowly, something beautiful happened. Margaret Thompson, the foundation director, stood up from her seat. Her eyes were full of tears, and her hands began to clap softly at first. Then Jaime and his mother rose too, clapping with emotion, their faces glowing with pride. One by one, every person in the room stood, not out of duty, not because it was polite, but because they had just witnessed something real, something powerful. And yet, the applause didn't come loud. It came quietly, almost like a heartbeat, steady and full of meaning. Then it stopped again, and the silence returned. Not because the moment had passed, but because it still lived in the air. No one wanted to break it. Even King Charles stood. At the back of the room, its expression was serious, but his eyes held something gentle, something rarely seen in public emotion. He placed his hand over his chest for a brief second. Those close enough to see it would never forget it. Kate finally looked up. Her eyes met the crowd, and what she saw took her breath away. Every face was turned to her, not in judgment, not in distance, but in connection. She had shown them her heart. And instead of turning away, they had leaned in. "Expect this," Kate said softly into the microphone, her voice still shaking. "Thank you. Not for the applause, but for listening, for seeing me." She wiped her cheek gently with the back of her hand, but didn't try to hide the tears. Her heart was still open, and for once, she didn't feel the need to close it. Then, slowly, she began to speak again, not because she had to, but because something inside her needed to finish the story. "There's a little girl I met last year," she said. Her name was Emma. She was only 8 years old. She had lived through things no child should ever have to face. When she first came to the foundation, she didn't speak, not one word. She would just sit in the corner, holding a small stuffed rabbit, looking at the floor. Kate paused, remembering the child's quiet eyes. But the counselors at the foundation didn't push her. They didn't demand that she talk or smile or pretend. They simply sat with her. Every day, quietly, gently, they waited. They let her know that it was okay to take her time. She was safe. Her voice trembled, but she went on, and after weeks of silence, Emma finally spoke. She looked up at one of the counselors and said, "I thought nobody would like me. If they knew how scared I was inside." A quiet gasp moved through the room. Many people lowered their heads. Others placed hands over their hearts. The story touched something very deep. That little girl believed she had to hide her fear in order to be loved, Kate continued. And I wonder, how many of us feel the same? How many of us carry pain inside but believe we must pretend everything is fine? She looked around the room again. We are told to be strong, to smile, to carry on. But strength is not pretending we're okay when we're not. Real strength is sharing our struggles. Real strength is asking for help. Her words landed softly but firmly. I have learned that tonight, from all of you. From Jaime, from Emma, from every brave soul in this room. A hand on her heart. You've shown me that healing begins with truth. Not just professional help, not just donations, but honest human truth. And tonight, you gave me the courage to tell my truth too. At that moment, many in the audience were wiping their eyes. Businessmen who had been checking their phones earlier were now standing still, deeply moved. Politicians who had come for photos were listening with real focus.
Ow.
Even celebrities known for polished appearances had let their guards down. Something sacred had taken over the evening. This was no longer a gala. It was a gathering of hearts. Kate looked out once more, eyes shining. I came here thinking I was supposed to inspire others, but you have inspired me more than you'll ever know. And with those final words, she stepped back from the podium. There was no music, no fanfare, just silence. and the overwhelming feeling that something had forever changed. Kate walked off the stage slowly, her heart still beating fast. Her hands were no longer shaking, but they felt light as if they had just let go of a heavy weight she had carried for years. She had spoken her truth in front of the world. Instead of judgment, she had been met with understanding. Instead of cold silence, she had been wrapped in something warm, something real, as she stepped down. People reached out to her. A mother whispered, "Thank you for seeing us," a donor said. "That was the most honest thing I've ever heard." A foundation worker, wiping her eyes, simply nodded. Kate gave a small, grateful smile to each of them. She had never felt so close to strangers in her life. Margaret met her near the back of the ballroom. The woman's eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I've seen many speeches over the years," Margaret said, "but this one will be remembered." Kate felt her throat tighten with emotion. She said what I felt. She replied quietly, "What I've always felt," but never dared to say out loud. The rest of the evening unfolded gently. No one rushed. The usual noise and laughter that came after speeches was gone. Instead, people sat together and truly talked. Not just about donations, but about real things. About pain, about healing, about the people they had met tonight. The whole mood of the event had changed at one table. A famous actor leaned in to speak with a teenage boy who had struggled with addiction. At another, a CEO asked a social worker how to get involved beyond writing checks. And in the back, Jaime was surrounded by people who wanted to hear more of his story, not out of pity, but out of admiration. Kate stood quietly to the side, watching it all. She didn't need to be in the center anymore. The stories had taken center stage where they belonged. The spotlight now rested on the people who had lived through storms and chosen to share their light anyway. Later, as the night came to an end, Kate stepped outside. The city was quiet. The stars peeked through the clouds above London. Cool air brushed against her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt calm. She looked up at the sky and whispered thank you. Not just to the stars, not to fate, but to the people who had opened their hearts to her. To the foundation. Two children like Emma and Jaime, they had reminded her of something precious, that no crown, no title, no role in the world mattered more than honesty, than connection, than being real. The next morning, news of Kate's speech had spread across the country. Headlines didn't talk about her dress. They didn't talk about how perfectly she smiled or who she sat next to. Instead, they spoke of courage, of truth, of a princess who laid down her script and chose to speak from the heart. People who had never cared about royal speeches before were watching clips of her words. Social media was filled with quotes from the evening. Healing begins with truth. Real strength is sharing your struggle. Even a princess can feel unsure, and that's okay. Parents who had been feeling tired and invisible felt seen. Teenagers battling anxiety saw hope. Teachers, nurses, workers, and everyday people wrote online that they had cried while listening. Not because it was sad, but because it was real. Even within the royal household, the response was different. Quiet staff members who had always kept a respectful distance were now stopping to thank her. One said, "I've worked here for 20 years, Your Royal Highness. I've never seen anything like that." King Charles himself sent a handwritten note. It was short but heartfelt. "What you did last night was more than royal duty. It was human truth. I'm proud of you." Kate read the letter alone in her study. Her eyes filled with tears once more, but this time they were not from nerves. They were from peace. She folded the note gently and placed it in a drawer beside a small photograph of her children. One day, she would tell them about this night. Not because it was grand or glamorous, but because it was true. And truth, she now believed, was the greatest legacy she could leave behind. As the sun rose over London, Kate stood by the same palace window where her morning had started. The world looked the same, but she had changed. The silence of the ballroom, the strength of the stories, the stillness of that standing ovation, all of it was now a part of her. She had found her voice, and she would never let it go again.